Dalen with another random making encounter. If you are returning to the channel, it is always good to see you. If you are new, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button. This project's a little bit different from what I've been working on. I've been doing a lot of things that are in boxes, so book nooks. All you book nookers out there, don't panic. There's a book nook on the bench. There are book nooks in my brain, but I wanted to break out of that box for this project and do some terrain. And it's really hard to do things that have a sense of openness in a box. By their very nature, they're very confining, and it's a challenge. And rather than tackle that challenge and just meet it head on, I decided to just completely bail on it and make a diorama. So, yeah, there's that. I also wanted to scratch a few itches. I wanted to do some 3D printing. I always love 3D printing. I wanted to paint some minis. I don't get a chance to paint as many minis as I would like, or probably should, considering the amount of models that I have and things that I've printed that are sitting in boxes and on shelves. I also wanted to break the static grass machine out because there's really just nothing so intensely gratifying and rewarding and spiritually and emotionally fulfilling as static grass. And yeah, there's probably something that we need to probably unpack in that. But there is static grass, there are rocks, there's dirt, there are trees, there's foliage, there's our adventurers in peril, there are trolls that are gonna pummel them, or maybe not, maybe they'll negotiate their way out of it. We don't know, who knows? I also want to spend a little bit of time, sorry about that, a little bit of time talking about how I approach a project. What inspires it? How do I compose the project? How do I ideate a little bit? There are a lot of great tutorials around how to do these things. And there will be plenty of this is how I did it in the video, but I want to also spend a little bit of time talking about sort of the thought process to take something that's in your brain, your great idea, and get it to a point where it's something that you can go and do. So with the word do in mind, let's just go and do it. Let's just go look at that project. Every project starts with something I want to accomplish. And in this case, I wanted to create a diorama that would fit exactly in a new glass display case that I had picked up from IKEA. Not a paid endorsement. With the concept in mind, then I start to gather all of the piece parts that I need. And for the characters, I'm using a bunch of figures that I found from Artisan Guild on My Mini Factory. No paid endorsements throughout this, but really love their sculpts, really love the style of these characters. You can see that the trolls are actually quite substantial compared to our heroes, our adventurers. And so I had initially 4 figures for the heroes, added a barbarian a little later on. We need a campfire for our friends to gather around and some bundles for them for their adventures. The trees are from Printable Scenery. Again, no paid money exchanging hands, but I really do love Printable Scenery's models and have used them quite a bit. Once everything's gathered, it's time to start doing some general layout. So I print all of the things that I'm going to use, or I have proxies or substitutes for them to start to lay out the things that I know that I'm going to want included in the diorama. And I start to think about all of the eye lines, all of the levels and layers and things that are pointing in certain directions to try to decide what the best layout is. It's not haphazard. Things need to sort of flow from one thing to the other. So I spend a lot of time at this point just really looking hard at all of the figures from a variety of different angles. Here you can see really looking at even the weapons, the lines all connect. We want the eye lines to point in certain areas, and we also want to be thinking about our good old rule of thumb, rule of thirds. Once that's sort of sorted out, I can start to just chunk in some of the foam to build some elevation up. This is all recycled packing foam. I'm a bit of a hoarder when it comes to nice clean sheets out of shipping containers. And this is the world's least expensive hot wire cutter. You don't really need anything too fancy for this kind of carving. You can literally use the least expensive hot wire cutters pretty much you can find. They all tend to work pretty well. You can also see there's a little bit of I've carved back on the edge of the overall perimeter, and this is to allow some thickness in the material that we're going to cover it with, which is Sculptamold. And you want to always have your substrate, your base layer, be a little bit sort of smaller than your final because you're going to be building on top of it. So I always want to plan for that additional thickness. It's pretty easy to forget about that. So we're using some Sculptamold, and I really love Sculptamold. It is a great product. A lot of people use things like air dry clay. There's some things called, I want to say Celluclay is one of them. The nice thing about Sculptamold or Sculptamold-like materials is they're plaster based. So that means that basically it's air dry in the sense that you need it to be dry and all the moisture out of it, but it actually sets when the plaster kicks. And so when that plaster starts to set up, you can start to move to smoothing and doing a little bit more. Fine detail is probably overly optimistic, but you can start to really smooth out and get your final details or your final shapes worked in, fill all the voids, all the cracks. You can see that there are some rocks here. The plaster rocks, those are plaster casts from Woodland Scenics rock molds. You could use tinfoil and create some rocks using tinfoil. You could also use some real rocks. You'll see later that I use a lot of regular real rocks. Here's the miraculous, after all the work goes in and I turn the camera back on, this is all the plaster done, all the Sculptamold, and everything's ready to go. The next step is to start to put in more of the scatter. So the way that I approach this strategically is the biggest, heaviest stuff goes in first. So when we think about the cliffs, the rock ledges, the rock faces, those are embedded in the actual Sculptamold. They're integral to the landscape. The next thing are the boulders, the rocks, the things that have broken off, fallen off, rolled down the hill. And you can see I'm using, these are actual real rocks that are from the craft store, the floral aisle. There are a lot of these different rocks that are used for floral arrangements. There's a little bit of track ballast in there that gives a different texture, but I'm working from the largest to the smallest. And so I've got the big boulder that rolled down, and then all of the bits that have flaked off from the big boulder, which are the smaller rocks. And then those are then embedded in some sand. So the sand in this is my smallest sort of rock level. And then this will all be embedded in dirt. So you never want to just plop a rock on top of something, because rocks don't do that. They do, but eventually dirt and mud and stuff sort of soaks in and around them, and they are embedded to some extent. So you always want to work from biggest to smallest and be embedding those layers. Now, using the cheapest craft paint humanly possible, I mixed up what I think is probably one of the most appalling colors I could possibly imagine. We all know what it looks like. There's no need in, really just sugarcoating it. This is just a really horrendous brown color. The purpose here is really to just cover the plaster so that when I put dirt on top of it, it's not going to show through if I have any gaps. I was so appalled by it that I made it worse by putting this color on top of it. Like, I felt it was too something, and yeah, this is just not getting any better. Thankfully, it's all going to get covered and it'll all be fine. But yeah, I'm not really sure what I was thinking at this point. The next step is going to be to just cover this horrendous thing with dirt. And If you haven't watched any of Luke Talon's videos over at Boulder Creek Railroad, I would highly recommend it. I think if you're a terrain builder, you probably have seen many of his videos. But the idea here is I'm just sifting good old-fashioned sifted dirt from a sifter, being sifted, I'm going to say sift one more time, onto the terrain. And it is a way to give it just a natural texture. The interesting thing about this is I am rethinking a little bit about what I'm going to use for some of my base. I think that dirt is good, but I've seen some really great terrain where they use some ground up additional materials that are have a little bit more fibrous material in them, sort of like coconut fiber or that stuff that you put in your like reptile bedding. Ground that up and use that. So I'm going to look at that because there's a little bit too much consistency or evenness to the dirt. And I think that nature is a little bit more twiggy, if you will. The weird thing about this is that we do end up actually painting the dirt. And so even though we're using natural materials, we end up painting everything so that it all comes together. So this is going to be layers of brown paints and washes and gray and lighter colors and washes on top of that. And then the rocks will eventually here in a second be miraculously finished with a few different layers of gray and then some washes and then some dry brush highlighting. If you're interested in how to paint rocks, again, there's a bazillion YouTube videos out there. It's really just a matter of layering. And so that's the thing to keep in mind. No great finish is one and done. Very few paint finishes that are natural and real and have depth to them are just a single layer. There are a lot of thin layers that build up over the course of your project that allow a lot of light and translucency and color and complexity work into your finish. So always be thinking about layers of color, light and dark, and sort of that push and pull and blending. So here we are kind of miraculously done with the base of the diorama. The dirt's looking pretty dirty, the rocks are looking like rock, and now we're getting to the really magical part of the whole thing. This was the reason for it all, static grass. So I'm using good old Mod Podge, matte Mod Podge, and a Woodland Scenics static grass applicator. There are a ton of things out there that static grass applicators, some are really incredibly expensive, some are incredibly cheap. The Woodland Scenics one, my only feedback is that I think that it really requires the wall transformer to work properly. It's battery powered or can be battery powered, but I find that it doesn't produce as good a result when it's just on battery power. I think it just needs that extra oomph that the wall transformer gives it. But with static grass, it's the same sort of process. You're going to build up layers of static grass. So I start with shorter 2 mil or whatever the short version is, and then I gradually build up to longer patches of longer grass embedded within the shorter grass. So you kind of build up your layers. This is also kind of a smorgasbord mix of grass colors. Grass is not homogeneous in the same color throughout, so you will find that, there could be dry patches. There could be patches that are greener, some that are a little more yellow because it's a little, dead in that area. Variety and variation is really critical to believability. Once the trees were painted, they needed to be integrated into the landscape. It might have been better to do this a little bit earlier, but I just integrated those in with some rock and dirt. Where the branches or the roots actually projected outside of the edge, I used a heat gun to actually warm it, and the cool thing about that PLA or the plastic is I can bend that over and shape those roots a little bit. At this point, I'm just using a collection of Army Painter tufts, some different foliage from a bunch of different sources, and then I made some tufts using, say it with me, static grass and some of this tuft glue, which when it dries, it sort of dries like that gummy snot dot stuff. It's kind of weird, kind of cool, and works really well. I'm incorporating a little bit of lichen and moss and fungus. Again, this is some fine turf or some turf from Woodland Scenic. I like their materials a lot, but you can use pretty much anything that comes to hand. And you can find lots of little assortment kits that have a lot of this fine turf with it. Here we have that really precise tuft placement. This should be a nice ASMR shot right here. Here you've noticed that I've actually realized that I needed to add 2 gigantic rocks to the diorama, because of course I did. It's just really never too late to change the idea if you really feel like you need it. In this case, it was critical that that bottom right corner, there was something that drove your eye up through to the top left. And so again, just repeating all of the process, all the steps, and to incorporate it all into the diorama. I integrated everything with a little bit of additional fine turf sprinkled generously throughout, and then it was time to add the characters. The first thing that I added was the campsite, mostly because it was the easiest to paint. And so those are the first things that went in. But one thing that, if we're thinking about how I came to this design, to this layout, was I was thinking that this is our adventurers are traipsing through the forest. They come across a space that they need to camp at. There's this weird standing stone. Kind of feels like it maybe is a sacred place. Maybe they probably potentially shouldn't have camped there if they knew that it was maybe a troll sacred place. But there's this little nook, there's this little alcove that is protected. They can kind of hunker down in this little nook. They've got some high ground behind them that they could take if they needed to. They've got something at their back, as long as the monsters don't come over the top onto them. But it gives them this sort of little sheltered place out of the wind, potentially out of the rain if there were any branches on those trees. But those are the sort of stories that I tell myself as I'm sort of designing it and I'm putting it together. Once all of this was glued in place, I was able to really focus on the characters, the figures themselves. They took a long time to paint. I ended up with, I think, 9 characters in total. So 4 trolls, 5 adventurers, and that was a lot of painting. And I also generally don't know when to quit. With the figures ready to be glued in place, I drill a small hole in their feet and super glue in a snipped off T-pin. Got to be careful not to drill through the top of their feet, which happened once, but you know what I mean. A little bit of PVA helps hold everything in place, and you can just jam that T-pin down into the foam, and it actually is quite a rigid mounting. And here we have everything basically done. All of the figures are glued in place. They are all really, I think that what's interesting is looking at how various elements of each of the figures tends to connect one to the other. The trick is to kind of do that without being too overly clear that that's what you're trying to do, but it is sort of creating this path around. It's at this time that I also realized that I hated the paint on the frame, so I repainted it with this bronze hammer finish. The original finish was just really smooth, and I don't know, I just kind of hated the color. It was a little too coppery, so I again decided that something that was done needed to be redone again, and that's probably why some of these videos take so long. But once it was repainted, I was much, much happier with the color. I think it worked better overall with the overall color of the diorama, and we were really set, and it was all buttoned up. I'm always super happy when this time comes. I hope you found this video entertaining, informative, and if you did, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, and we will see you again with another random making encounter.